afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louise Sue. I'm a retired naval captain, and I'm the team lead for the Friends Forums. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to Atelier D, which of course is named after our president of the Friends of the Canadian War Museum, Brigadier General retired Linda Caldwell. First of all, Friends Forums we try to hold one once a month. We try to hold it on a Thursday if it's try to hold it Thursdays generally, either in-house or online in a Zoom. And we tend to get our posters out as soon as one event is over. We're trying to work to get to the next event underway. We do, I will tell you later about some events that we have coming up, but let me just start by saying that this is an opportunity for us to fundraise a little bit for Friends, but more importantly, I think, it's to give some kind of value added, some networking, some opportunity as friends of the War Museum to connect, to talk. So it is important for us that people see each other at these events and talk about the things that interest them, and often bring us topics as well. So keep that in mind. We're always looking for new ideas. Please, sir, please join us. Welcome. So I'm just getting started with an introduction, sir, so please just join us. So this is an opportunity, as I said, for us to fundraise, but also for us to connect as a community, and that is very important to us, and certainly should you have topics, please feel free to share them. I will let you know that we, in the course of a year, we donate at least $100,000 to the War Museum. That's not a small amount of money. We always are concerned of what we donate our money for. We sow some due diligence around that to ensure that it's programming. Youth is a big part of our mandate, as part of the museum's mandate to get youth engaged in the War Museum. So things like learning boxes that are sent to the schools across the country that have materials on the First and Second World War are first of all, very popular with teachers, and second of all, we support that to the tune of about $50,000. So we are a pretty important player in that kind of engagement here in the War Museum, and we continue to work in that space and to provide the things that they need moving forward. Now, today in particular, I will highlight by saying that we did put a poster out, so we have given Dr. Hebb's bio out ahead of time. And we've given you a little, I think a fair bit of background actually on it. It's unusual for us to give as much background as we have in the talk. So I've decided not to go with your actual bio, Dr. Hebb. And normally I would just call him Padre, but if you look at the Reverend Canon Doctor, it's hard to know which of the titles to use. Whereas it's so much easier in the Navy, you just say Padre and you're covered.
You got it all.
Yeah, you're covered. Having said that, what I did find in my little internet search is actually found a line of his that he wrote once, that I thought might kind of connect between his bio and the talk today. And I think as you listen to the talk today, perhaps you can reflect on what I'm going to say here and see, in fact, if they do connect together. And it's something he wrote. I seek to reflect on how cultural, political, and spiritual trends impact the lives of individuals, communities, and of the broader society in which we live. And I think you're going to see that this very much is in line with some of the stuff, some of what you're going to hear today. So on behalf of all of you present, please, I would like to welcome Dr. Hebb. Dr. Hebb to the podium.
Just arrange the microphone here accordingly. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. I appreciate the audience and the attention to this matter, which is, of course, one of Canadian history, but a limited, slim slice of it, Padres during the Great War. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Canadian War Museum for inviting me, Louise and David for their hospitality and their kindness. And I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Glenn Wright here, who's a friend of mine from the Canadian Catholic Historical Association, a group to which I belong, and a group which, of course, shares an interest in Roman Catholic Padre J Murdoch and his Great War autobiography, The Red Vineyard. I want to begin today by setting a bit of context, and that is that, as a matter of historical interest, there has been little written about Canadian chaplains during the Great War for most of the intervening time. Up until Duff Greer's 1995, Padres in No Man's Land, Canadian chaplains in the Great War, there wasn't all that much to be found to research or to read about the contributions of Canadian chaplains. A first edition came out in 1995, and then a second edition in time for the centenary in 2014. There were roughly 500, some say 524, 525 Canadian chaplains in the First World War of the main denominations of the country, many of the Protestants, including Salvation Army, and also, of course, the Roman Catholic chaplains. and there were 96 to 100 Roman Catholic chaplains during the course of the war. Some of the chaplains served just in Canada, but the majority did serve overseas, in England, in the hospital system there. And then also the ultimate appointment was, of course, to get to the continent, and they could serve in the hospitals in the continent, and also the ultimate posting was forward to be a chaplain to the actual fighting men, which meant the artillery and all the support units, ammunition, columns, etc., as well as the infantry units at the front. Now, usually in the intervening 100 years, as well as the ethos of the CEF at the time of the war was very Protestant, and you just have to think about, the Minister of Militia to understand that. Also the history, the writing of the history that happened, and this includes Duff Greer's too, that has a decidedly Protestant ethos to it. But Roman Catholics and Roman Catholic theology and perspectives are in the historiography of Canadian First World War chaplains often little understood, undervalued, and certainly underappreciated. And to crown all that off, of course, is how many of you heard of Padre B. J. Murdoch before today? By contrast, the most famous Canadian World War I chaplain was Canon Frederick G. Scott. And he wrote his work, The Great War as I Saw It, came out in 1922. He was an Anglican, and it's interesting that Murdoch says in his writings that, well, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, was really the official denomination of the British Empire and of all British forces. And everybody related to that fact. But Canon Scott was a well-known Canadian cleric, Montreal, Quebec connections, McGill University connections. He knew and was known, he was published, he was a poet. And then in his 50s, he snuck himself overseas with the first Canadian contingent, which was a bit of a trick. He shouldn't have gone, he was way too old to qualify to go overseas. And even more amazingly, he snuck himself to the continent. And then once in the continent, he said his #1 principle was to stay away from generals and headquarters. Because, of course, at first he feared them because they saw this old geezer, they'd send him back to England. But he escaped. He was a poet, he was a priest, he was a wit. Note the title of his book, which was written in 1922, just a year before Murdoch's came out. The Great War as I Saw It. He's not claiming any universality to his account whatsoever. It's my Great War account, and it's what I experienced. And so he's not trying to universalize at all, although that needs to be qualified. Now, the question about it, if you own a copy or have read a copy of it, is the man and the book and the account of Scott a one of a kind, a one-off? Or is it, in some sense, representative, at least of the Anglicans or of the Protestant side? That's an open question. So to what extent is he representative? And then to compound that question with Scott, you have the trouble within Anglican circles, he'd be known as an Anglo-Catholic. That is to say, he was an odd sort of Protestant because he carried a pyx, which is where you carry the reserve host or consecrated elements. He had on his altar, the way he celebrated, not the typical quintessential Protestant empty cross, but a crucifix. And also, he records doing last rites for dying soldiers. So an odd Protestant indeed. Now, his book went through 2 editions, and his second edition came out, and notice that there's some of the stuff, it's got some of his poetry in the front of it, and there's an appendix including the names of thousands of all ranks who served overseas in the Great War, and whose signatures appear in Canon Scott's copy of the first edition. So this was his second edition was a publishing event in and of itself. By way of contrast, way back in the East Coast, in a place called the Maritimes, and within the Maritimes, a place called New Brunswick, and within backwoods New Brunswick, there was down the Miramichi River Valley, There was a place called Newcastle, and then next to it was a place called Chatham. Newcastle was one thing. Chatham was quite heavily Roman Catholic. They had a cathedral and a bishop in Chatham, New Brunswick, in those days. Father Benedict Joseph Murdoch, a young, newly ordained, impressionable Catholic priest from Maritime Canada. He had gone into the priesthood, wasn't quite sure if parish ministry was right for him, spoke to the bishop, went to Philadelphia to a religious order to try himself out for several months, seeing whether or not he had a calling or a vocation to the religious life, that is, cloistered religious life. He came back from that, and boom, there was a war on. And there was a recruitment drive, this is in late 15 and into 16, for the 132nd Infantry Battalion. Was raised, this is in 1916, because the original battalions in New Brunswick were the 26th, and then there were also, you know, the 44th, and et cetera on in. Once you're over 100, you're in the 1916. 132nd Infantry Battalion was raised in his area. And Murdoch went to some of the recruiting, I mean, he was a young man, and he went to some of the recruiting meetings, and they were big public events, and they were public speakers, and one of the things that the public speakers lamented were the lack of chaplains, of people volunteering to be chaplains. And, you know, there were some Protestants there that were, you know, sort of thinking that they might stand up and volunteer, and then, not to be outdone, he actually volunteered one night. He got sort of carried away with the moment. And the newspaper covered that the next day. And his bishop was there drinking his morning coffee, and he reads that one of his priests has volunteered to go overseas in his newfangled infantry battalion. He didn't tell me, he thought he was going overseas. So we got called in, raked over the coals, and there was trouble. But then the colonel of the battalion found out, went and visited the bishop, and everything was fine. Murdoch was in.
There we go.
Okay. Now, this is the cover of my book, and it has that picture of Murdoch. One of the differences between Murdoch and Scott is you can go on, you know, the website and put in Canon Frederick Scott, CEF, get all sorts of pictures. You go in and put in for Murdoch, you get this picture. Various forms of it from various periods of history, but it's always the same photograph. That's a photograph of him before he went overseas. Young man, and this is the one that's on the cover of my book, and it's the only decent picture of Murdoch. Because later on in life, things didn't go well for him because he suffered from PTSD. He lived in a cabin back in the woods. He came out and he ended up living in a sort of a semi-nursing retirement home in the late 60s, early 70s, and we have a few Polaroid pictures from that time period. If you know anything about how well Polaroid pictures have persisted from that time period, you realize why I'm not even trying to project one of those. So that's Murdoch, and it's the only decent picture you're ever going to see of him. He published 1 year after Scott, in 1923. He self-published. You might notice about Scott, he was a big Canadian national publisher, which means publish the book, embrace the cost of publishing it and distributing it. Poor old Murdoch in Chatham, New Brunswick, he had to self-publish. He sent the manuscript to a small American Roman Catholic publishing house known as the Torch Press in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That's who published it. And I don't know for sure what the original publishing run was. It was probably 1,000 books. There was no national publisher from Murdoch and no distribution network. Letters and mail order only to and from him. So he did all the work himself. There was no other way to do it in those days, particularly if you didn't have a publisher. It went through 10 known editions. Murdoch went on to write 10 more books, 2 more autobiographies, a bunch of prose stories, and 1 or 2 devotional books. And the last edition that I've encountered yet, and this is something I'm interested in, if you can find an edition that's more recent than 1958, I'd be interested to hear about it. And that last edition was done by a small Irish Roman Catholic publishing house in 1958, edition number 10. He also, of course, did all these books and all the selling of all his books in the same manner. When he was dying in 1973, he told the executive of his will, Father Creamer, who was a person I knew, that his one concern was to use his money to pay off the debt to the publisher in Ireland because he had his last book coming back. That was his concern. So in 1973, he was still self-publishing and paying out of his own pocket. And he did all the books, the 10 books, with no house, no office, no staff, and no assistants. Now, Murdoch's, the name of his book, The Red Vineyard. On the one hand, Scott's name of his book was The Great War as I Saw It. And as I said, this is great. It's a very reasonable debate and discussion could be held as to what extent it's representative and what extent it's just subjective and just his story. But he says, The Great War as I saw. Murdoch, very different. The Red Vineyard. The vineyard is biblical reference, obviously, Old Testament and New Testament. He was a priest working in the Lord's vineyard. But the vineyard in which he worked was red. And the red is the blood of the dying soldiers. And within the context of the Red Vineyard, he tells the story. It's during the 100 Days, September 1918, where, once he's done this intense moment, 10 intense hours, he looks at his hands and they're covered with blood, and he has to go through the grass to wipe it off, because he's been helping the stretcher bearers and he's been administering last rites to both Canadians and German soldiers who are dying. So Murdoch's Red Vineyard follows a general chronological structure. He tells the story about volunteering, I mentioned that earlier, his new uniform, and walking down the street in Chatham with his uniform on, trying to sneak from house to house, corner to corner, because if he got seen, people would be pointing out to him and be calling to their neighbors, "Oh, this is the priest, Father Monarch, look, he's got his new uniform on." And he ran into a bunch of kids and that they pretended to salute him and all of that. So he's very human in his storytelling. He also makes a big deal out of his Mass set, the communion set that was purposely made for him. He tells about training in Canada. He speaks about all the Roman Catholic mothers who come up to him and said how extremely grateful they were that, "Father, you're going with my boy, and you'll look after him." And look after him meant look after him that he doesn't get himself in trouble, look after him morally, but above all, look after him spiritually. Make sure he stays in straight and narrow, does his confession, receives his communion, and stays that way. He tells about the voyage overseas and his first impressions of England. Now, all those things are quite typical of World War I accounts, and Murdoch has that as well. He first serves as a camp priest in England. And the 132nd Battalion, we're in 1916, and the Battle of the Somme going on. The Canadians will be sent to Courcelette later on in September. There are going to be very heavy casualties, so all the battalions coming from Canada need to be broken up for reinforcements, and they all are, including the 132nd. Now, this devastates Murdoch because he loses his connection with all the boys. I just told you about the mothers saying how grateful they were, and they're broken up in the drafts and sent overseas in different units, to the continent. And there he is, disconnected. He doesn't have a battalion anymore, which was his parish. What's he going to do? So anyway, he's in the army. He gets assigned to assist another priest in one of the camps in England, Bramshot, etc., down in the south. So he's there and serves there for a number of months. Then he's sent to France as a hospital chaplain. And there things get very serious because the wounds from the front, soldiers wounded in the front, stretcher bearers bring them in to regimental aid station. Then he's sent back from there to the CCS casualty clearing station. From the CCS he's sent usually by ambulance or by hospital train. Usually he's loaded in and the trains take the wounded by the train load to the 10 hospitals along the French coast, places like Boulogne, etc. I have a book on a Canadian nurse over there, her diary from 1915-16, telling about working in one of those hospitals. And she was in the McGill unit, and she was from New Brunswick. So they unloaded the wounded from the train onto ambulances, and then they took them to the hospitals. And then when they got to the hospitals, they were triaged. And, could they wait for a while? Did they have the surgery immediately, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the basic. And then in the hospitals, they often had surgery, and then they were in wards to recover. And it was the job of the nurses to keep the soldiers alive, and it was also the job of the chaplain to minister to all the Roman Catholics within that hospital complex. And there could be hundreds of them. And not everybody survived. One of the great problems were people severely wounded, obviously, but hemorrhaging was a real problem. And in the night, if the men moved around in the bed after having a leg or an arm off, they might start bleeding, and it was a nurse's job to catch that, to see it, even though it was in the dark often, and they weren't allowed to have any lights. And if not, the person might bleed out and die. Anyway, there were many instances in which the priest had to be called for on short notice and had to go. And often it was last rites in the hospital system. And Murdoch, being an exceedingly conscientious young priest, once took part of the day off and went into the town and come back and found on his door a note from a head nurse in one of the wards saying, "Come quickly, Father, there's a man dying." And he got to the ward, and the young fellow had just died a few minutes earlier, and he was absolutely devastated. He had screwed up major, and he couldn't feel any worse. But the head nurse came over and said, "No, don't worry, Father. When you didn't come, I called Father so-and-so, and he came in and did the last rites." A ton off his shoulders. So that's the sort of very conscientious young priest that he was. He tells stories about the nurses, the doctors, and the troop trains. Now, there's a beautiful story in Murdoch, and I must tell this one. This is one about troop trains. He tells a story about, and this is another thing that's very good about the Red Vineyard, he integrates life in the French countryside and the French population as well, with all the hundreds of thousands of British troops who were there. So he tells a story about the troop trains coming up from the coast towards the front. And these new energetic soldiers, and they're leaning out of the windows and they're cheering, going on, and then they come to a stop. And at the stop, things get quiet, and all of a sudden one of the troops says, "Are you downhearted?" And the whole train explodes with a "No!" And the French children pay attention to this. And then they start imitating this when the train arrives. They say, "Are you downhearted?" Them trying to replicate the English, and there's this big roar of "No" coming out of the troop train. So that's the troops going up. But he says the French children notice there's something very different, because there's other trains that come back from the front, and they've got this white circle with a red cross through it. And in those trains, there's no men leaning out the windows. You may see a bandaged head through one of the windows, and the trains are very quiet. And he says that's the extraordinary contrast. And the children notice the difference between this exuberance going forward and the calm, patient suffering of the return. And he tells that story from the perspective of the French children. A powerful story indeed. Finally, Murdoch is promoted to the front. So it's a sequence basically of seasoning or hardening up the chaplains. First in England in the camps, then in the hospitals, and then finally forward to the front, if they can meet the muster. And so he goes to frontline duty, and he's assigned, as a Roman Catholic, he's assigned as a brigade chaplain. Usually, and this is one of the differences between the Protestant and the Roman Catholic system, or the way it was handled in the First World War, the Protestants usually each battalion of roughly, well, on paper 1,000 men, but it was never really that at the front, say 800 men, they had a Protestant chaplain resident with them. But the Roman Catholics were spread throughout the entire CEF, through all the infantry battalions, and there were enough Catholic priests to have one in each infantry battalion, because that would be dozens and dozens of them just there. And so a Roman Catholic chaplain had to be a brigade chaplain, which meant he has responsibility for 4 different infantry battalions. And if I remember right, he was with the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th of the 3rd Brigade. That's where Murdoch was assigned. And the minister to all the Roman Catholics spread among those 4 battalions. And the percentage of Roman Catholics within each one of those battalions varied. Like, there was one time in which the 13th had, 60% Roman Catholics, The 14th, where he was immediately connected to, had 20%. The 15th had something like 25, and the 16th something like 35. So he was spread between all of those. And there was one point towards the end of the war, he got moved from one of those battalions to another, from a battalion that had a lot of Roman Catholics to one that had next to none. But as he said, it's the army, I had to follow orders, so away he went. Now this is another place where there's a big contrast between Canon Scott and Murdoch. Canon Scott tells about having a horse, Dandy, that he rode. And then when Dandy was taken away from him, he maneuvered himself, Scott was a real charmer, into getting a motorcycle and a sidecar, and a driver, a chauffeur to boot. So he toured all around the 1st Division, forward areas, the reserve, everywhere, stayed away from headquarters mostly, to get around. Murdoch, a Roman Catholic chaplain, responsible for 4 spread out infantry battalions. Usually 2 would be in the front trenches, 2 in reserve if they were up front, or they were back resting. There were 4 battalions, but you can't have all those men in one place, so they're scattered from village to village, from barn to barn. He had to get around all of them. He was lucky, after a while, to get a bicycle. Up until then, he only had his feet. So, no horse, no motorcycle, but just a bicycle. And then there was a point at which he lost that. And so he was always torn, conflicted, where to go, where to have services, and how to go about doing it, because he always had 4 different groupings he had to try to get to. And it wasn't just his infantry battalions, he had other support crews that he had to administer to as well. So he was all the time on the go, and all the time conflicted as to what was the best way to handle the situation. He did have, as an officer, a Batman, and his name was George. Okay, some perspective and analysis of the Red Vineyard. Murdoch saw his role as that of a priest. His role was that as a priest. Not a morale builder, not a gung-ho fellow, but as a priest. His concern were with the Roman Catholic troops overseas, his lads. He calls them the great-hearted Catholic lads. And his concern with them was their spiritual health and well-being. So his primary task was to bring the sacraments of the Catholic Church to the lads of the CEF. That meant primarily confession and absolution, obviously, and also celebrating Mass and administering Mass, the body of Christ, to his Catholic lads. And also, and he frequently worked with the medical units, and in the last 100 days, that's where he planted himself. That's where all the chaplains were planted, were forward with the attacking infantry battalions during the 100 days, the last 100 days of the war, to work with the medical staff, because that's where you'd have to be in the right place at the right time to administer last rites. And he did it equally for German wounded soldiers as he did for the Canadians. Now, before a battle, and when you get to the 100 days, they knew when the battles were going to happen. And before a battle, the role was to prepare the men, the Catholic men, for the very real possibility of being killed within perhaps the next 15 minutes, or the next few hours, or within the next 24 hours. That was his role. And to do that, they were to confess and to receive the Holy Communion, and to have their souls right before God as they went into battle, to prepare them for eternity. And as I said, this included the wounded Germans he encountered as well. And Murdoch speaks several times in his book about preparing men before battle and then seeing them severely wounded or dead within the next 24 hours. So this was something that was a lived daily reality. Now one of the advantages that Murdoch had over Scott was this. As a Catholic priest, he belonged to a pre-existent transnational institution. None of Canada's Protestant chaplains did. There were Canadian Methodist, Canadian Anglican, Canadian Baptist, Salvation Army from Canada. Even within the Protestant spectrum, all of them were narrow. But Murdoch, who also, being from New Brunswick, spoke French, big advantage when you're in France, belonged to a transnational institution, the Roman Catholic Church. And his membership in that, and particularly being a priest in that organization, eclipsed and was more important than any national, ethnic, or linguistic boundaries. So what did this mean in practice? And then in practice, that when battalions were moved, for instance, in reserve or to a rest area, Murdoch, unlike all the Protestant chaplains, could go to the local Roman Catholic Church and the curé, the priest there, and say, "Here I am." He could say it in French too. "I'm a Catholic padre and the Canadians are here." And the church was his. He had a church. All the Protestants didn't have such a thing. They might have a tent if they were lucky. And Canon Scott speaks about being lucky to have the engineers build him, chapel structures in the rear areas on a couple of occasions. But Murdoch always had the local Catholic church. Sometimes he went to a small village and the Catholic priest was, of course, serving in the French army, which they had no choice but to do, by the way. And they didn't serve as priests. They served as infantry, carrying the weapons. But Murdoch had a pre-existent church, and then he looked after the locals as well as the soldiers. So that's an extraordinary difference and an extraordinary advantage that Murdoch had as his Catholic priest. Now, the Red Vineyard is a chaplain's story. It begins with his personal decision to volunteer, even before he had Episcopal permission. And it goes all the way to his last Mass in Germany, Cologne Cathedral, on Christmas Eve, December the 24th, 1918. And then it ends. It's structured, the Red Vineyard is structured into 100 chapters, short, 2 to 5 pages each one. And the last one is about this Catholic Mass. And he had a problem with this Catholic Mass because he was looking for the Christmas Mass. He was in Germany, part of the occupying forces, in the Cologne Cathedral, and the midnight Mass was coming up, and the music was going to be fantastic. And of course, the German clergy were there. And the German priest came up to him and asked permission to administer communion to the Canadian lads. The German priest administering to the Canadians. And Murdoch was torn, but he knew the answer he had to give. He said yes. And so, that was part of the reality. And then the book concludes with that Christmas Mass. And there's one final concluding chapter, which is just a gem, about a bit of reminiscence about it. So it is strictly a story of his chaplaincy in the military. How am I doing for time? All right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're fine.
I'm fine, okay, very good. The Red Vineyard is replete with self-reflection. I already mentioned the new uniform. Then there was the burden of the drunken soldiers. This is a wonderful, very human story. I'd like to say it's very reminiscent of New Brunswick, too, in my early ministry there. The soldiers trained in New Brunswick at first, and then they went off to Valcartier. They came back from Valcartier towards Halifax for embarkation overseas, and they came by way of troop train. And all the way through the Gaspé and down through New Brunswick, every train, every village and town they stopped at, the locals would greet them. And of course, the men would bring out the bottle and give to the young lads to have a swig. And the thing that we have to remember from this time period is that when they speak about the evils of alcohol, they mean hard liquor. They don't mean weak beer. They mean 40 proof. So by the time the troop train got to Newcastle and Chatham, most of the the vast majority were plastered. It was a public holiday. Everybody was out to greet their boys in their Sunday best, and a trainload of drunks pulled in. Murdoch was absolutely scandalized. He would have been in his part of the train probably oblivious to what was going on at all these stops. You know, the last person they were going to show the bottles to was the chaplain. So he was absolutely scandalized. So they go on, and the next couple of days they sober up, and he has this church parade with all the Catholic lads, and he has this proposal. He says, here's the cards, the pledge cards, and you can pledge to be sober for the remainder of your time in the army, excluding the rum ration, because that's medicinal. So he allowed for that. So the pledge cards, handed out 200 pledge cards and got, well over 100 of them filled out. And as well, he had a silk stole, or Damascus, silk, we'll say a silk scarf, and all their names are written on that scarf and put on his portable altar so that they'd be remembered and prayed for at every Mass, to be able to have the grace of God to keep their pledge. And so that was what Murdoch did, as a very practical, priestly and pastoral approach to that problem. And so that's a wonderful story. The necessity of always being available for last rites while a hospital chaplain, I've already told you that story, that incident, as well awareness of other sufferings. For instance, the story of the troop trains and the French children. And then also he devotes an entire chapter, well, more than a chapter, to how the mothers and wives and families of the soldiers suffered in Canada. Not just when they got the telegraph, but all the rest of the time too. Years of not knowing, are they alive or are they dead? Are they wounded? What is their status? And so he devotes time to that. And then he also has a whole chapter on the letters he wrote to the families of the men who were killed. And he gives an example of the letter that he wrote, and he tried to include personal details. And then also he includes in that chapter a half a dozen of the letters he received back from the wives and the mothers that he'd written to. So thankful that there was this one instance in this one dying lad, and he said, any messages for home? Murdoch said to the young man, he had received last rites and he was dying, and the young lad said, tell my mother I had the priest. So the greatest consolation the dying young soldier could communicate to his mother was that he had the ministrations of the Catholic Church through Murdoch, the priest, as he died. And that would be soulless to her as much as is humanly possible. Murdoch also, here we are over 100 years later, and Canada has changed considerably in the interim. 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, they outbreak the First World War, and during the First World War, Canada was explicitly and self-consciously a Christian country. Various Christian denominations, but everybody considered themselves Christian. Vast majority of people went to church. Atheists were, as common as Martians, etc. And that colors that generation's and that time period's understanding of the war experience. And one of the places you see that shine through is in these chaplains' accounts, in Canon Scott and in Murdoch. And so, rather than the disillusionment narrative that became very popular 10 years after the war was over, and by that I mean Graves and Sassoon and Remarque and London, and also the use of some of the poetry that had been made of Owen, which is very bizarre, seeing as he could have not gone back in the fall of 18, but he chose to. Wilfred Owen, the great anti-war poet, so to speak, or so acclaimed. So a very different time period. And part of that time period, and part of the permeated Christianity within the culture, is that they believed in the possibility of the redemptive suffering in relation to selfless sacrifice, not senseless suffering. The model, of course, is Christ and his mother Mary. So those are real operative concepts that people just didn't think about, but it was how they lived and wanted to live and wanted to die in those concepts and within that context of the notion that there can be such thing as redemptive suffering, because that's obviously the purpose of the cross from a Christian perspective, and also that selfless sacrifice is the highest thing. Think of all the churches with the inscriptions, greater love is no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. So those things are all there. Now, the other thing that makes Murdoch very different is this. Unlike Canon Scott, Murdoch related how his war experiences, as they were unraveling, he was experiencing, he tells of what they were, and he also relates how they were impacting him, changing him, altering him at the time. In other words, his development of shell shock or PTSD. And he makes that very clear. One of the places and one of the means and ways in which he does that is in 1950, shortly after he was over there when he was still in England, he went to Parkminster for a retreat for a week. And he went to the retreat house, and it was a sun retreat for a week. And it was wonderful for him. He said he was able to get into the headspace and have a retreat. A year later, after being on the continent and also being forward, he went on a retreat. He had leave and he got back to England, did the same thing. Catholic priest going to go on retreat. You got leave, you don't go drinking and womanizing in London, you go on retreat. So he did. It was agony. He couldn't, the silence, he was restless. He couldn't focus, he couldn't concentrate. He was restless, he was distracted, and he was glad to get back to France. And he says that a year at the front had done its work on me. So that's before 1918. And so as things go on, and this is another thing which is distinctive about the Red Vineyard. The Red Vineyard, 300 pages. But as a disproportionate amount of that narrative is devoted to the 100 Days campaign, the August to November. And in that 100 days, of course, is the great battles, the Amiens, Arras, the line, the Canal du Nord, Cambrai, Valenciennes, the whole thing. And he was with the forward battalions, with the stretcher bearers, following the attacking troops during that time period, and working with the doctors at the regimental aid centers. And at that time, during the 100 Days campaign, the thing to remember for people who aren't familiar, that was the end of trench warfare. They were out in the open, they were walking across open, roving, undulating French fields. All completely open. No trees, no trenches, no nothing. And so during that time period, Murdoch was machine gunned. He tells about the experience of there was this advance. He said, there's an advance. So he ran out of the regimental aid station to go with the stretcher bearers to follow immediately behind the attacking troops across the field. Well, the troops get out, they fall down. The stretcher bearers go out. One of those fellows falls down, and Murdoch is out there with them. They're under machine gun fire from off in the distance, and they're all been hit. And Murdoch lays in his belly and administers last rites to one of the men on the field, who dies before he's finished doing it. And then he's stuck out there with the machine gun bullets cutting the grass off over his head. And he's facing into the dirt. And then eventually he squirms himself off the field into a little ditch off to the side. So that was one of his experiences during that time. Another time, the front was very fluid, and the Canadians were pushing forward. They pushed forward into this one village, but it was still contested. Germans on one side, German artillery on the other side, Canadians and Canadian troops just entering the village. Canadians were in the village, had set up a regimental aid station, and Murdoch was a bit behind, and he had to go to that village. But the Germans had an artillery barrage down between him and the village. And he had to force himself to walk through the barrage to get to the village. And he says, my mind said, yes, I'm going, but my feet didn't want to move. And still he forced himself to walk through that barrage to get to the village, find the regimental aid station, and there do what he did, help the doctors and also administer the last rites when it was necessary. And it was either at that instance, I think that was the time when there was a chaplain wounded brought in, and it was Canon Scott. So their paths crossed at that point. That's where Ken and Scott got wounded, and he was out of the war from that moment on. Murdoch wasn't. So he'd been machine gunned, he'd been through this bombardment, but then at night, the Canadian troops pushed forward, and they would camp just wherever they ended. And the Germans were sending planes over top and trying to figure out where the Canadians were and bombing them every night. And at that point, there were no trenches dug, they were just out in the open. And all he had was his fly sheet or his rain sheet between him and the bombs falling from the sky. And he said, I was there, just clutching the grass, expecting to be blowing the fragments the next moment. Another incident in the last 100 days, he was on the side of a road administering last rites to the wounded, and a German plane comes over and strafes him with the machine guns down the road. So Murdoch experienced combat firsthand, and by the end of the war, it was really affecting his nerves. He speaks about, this is in September, I think 1918, they had a little break, the other battalions were sent forward to continue the attack. Some of his battalions were brought back to rest and be resupplied with new men, which were the people conscripted and were there by that point to fight. And he stayed with the local curé, the priest in the rectory. And the priest lived with his sister. His sister functioned as his housekeeper. And he said, I would come down in the morning, and his sister, the curé's sister, would have a pear on Murdoch's place setting at the table. And he said, those small acts of kindness at that time moved me to tears. That's how brittle and fragile he was at that point. And so Murdoch writes The Red Vineyard in 1923, and it comes out and is published. The first edition sells out very quickly, and he has to get more printed off. But one of the things about the Red Vineyard is that he uses himself as a guinea pig example to the Canadian public. This is my war experience, like Can and Scott told, but this is what happened to me, and this is how I reacted to it at the time. And not just at the time, but my emotional, psychological reaction to these events at the time didn't go away when I left there. They stayed with me. I was marred or scarred by those experiences. And so he tells his story to the Canadian public, and he uses himself as a guinea pig to help explain to the Canadian public why their boys were not the same as they were when they went over originally. Because they had on these experiences, and you do not undergo these experiences and still come out the same you were before. And Murdoch is way ahead of his time, by using himself as an example to try to begin to explain to the Canadian public that this is what war is like. And that places him very different from Can and Fred Scott, and it certainly is an argument in and of itself, the importance of Murdoch's work and the importance that it be more generally known to the Canadian public. It is a crucial part of World War I Canadian autobiography, it is a crucial part of Canadian World War I historiography, and it's a crucial stepping point towards the very beginnings of an understanding of the effect of modern industrialized warfare upon those who participate in it. And that Murdoch is pretty clear that that doesn't just include the frontline soldiers, it includes all our artillery, it includes medical officers, it includes the nurses, it includes all who saw the effects of modern industrialized warfare in the early 20th century. So on that note, I think I'll conclude for today and take any questions you may have. There are 12 copies of my book signed and available in the bookstore if you're interested in picking up a copy of J Murdoch, The Red Vineyard Revisited. Thank you. Questions, folks? Yes.
Hearing confessions, giving absolution and counsel. Does Murdoch talk about the conflict that his soldiers felt, not in preparing themselves for death, but for destroying the image of God in the enemy, in the Germans? you talk about, is that part of the confession that allows these young people to go again and again to the front, knowing that they are killing others, you know, part of that destruction? Is that part of their confession and absolution, knowing that they're there out of necessity, but they're also doing harm?
Yes, that's a very good question. The short answer is I can't say for sure. I do know I have come across, there was a manual, and Mark McGowan makes reference to it in his article, about a little manual that was used by a Catholic priest to assist the soldiers in making their confession. But of course, being late 20th century, he was just focusing on the sexual side of things. And there was no, and I have not personally seen that sort of manual. Has anybody here in their research come across a manual for Roman Catholic priests to assist in confession during the First World War? Mark McGowan did reference one, and that would be the place to really see, for sure. I'm not entirely sure that it would be there, and this is the reason for it. The very framing of your question sort of reflects the time of period in which we live in.
Precisely. And
was not the way in which people looked at the war or their participation in it, in the Great War. That wasn't it. The notion that Christian nations fight one another had been going on for well over a millennia and wasn't anything new. Both sides, you know, it's a post that time period sort of way of looking at the world, and wasn't necessarily, certainly, the foremost of their minds or concerns at that moment. Yes, sir.
Has Murdoch or Scott's experiences in the books been used in any future training for other chaplains beyond the war?
That's a very good question. I'd say that the short answer to that would be no. Canon Scott was a famous individual. He went west with to try to calm things down in the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919. Authorities got a hold of him and sent him back. So, and his book was seen as, you know, a great read, but I don't know if they, you know, garnered any insights from it. Murdoch, I can say for most likely, for absolutely sure, no, it wouldn't have been used to inform manuals or such like. Murdoch had a great deal of trouble after the war. He was in a parish for a while, and then he had to take a break. When he was sent back, he got his leave just after the Christmas Mass. They sent him back to England, and they left him in England. They knew the fragile state of mind he was in. There were letters from his immediate superior and a higher up superior to Murdoch's bishop saying he's done wonderful work, but the man's worn out, and give him some time off when he comes back. And the bishop thought, oh great, give him 3 months off. 3 months didn't do the trick. So Murdoch continued to have trouble. He was hospitalized. He came out. They sent him on a recovery trip to Florida. Well, he needs a real break, so we'll send him to Florida for the winter. He got as far as Montreal, hadn't slept in 3 days, and checked himself in the hospital. And there'd just been a Canadian doctor come back as an expert from England in treating PTSD, well, shell shock. And there, Murdoch was under his care for 3 weeks, and they gave him strychnine injections. They really didn't know what they were dealing with. Anyway, he settled down enough, and he was able to go to Florida and spend time down at St. Augustine, Florida area, and then come back and was in a parish again. And when he came back, he threw himself in to finishing the Red Vineyard. It was his one big goal in life, to get this out of his system. And Murdoch, like Canon Scott, had a diary, and he kept, because there's way too much detail here not to be a diary as a basis. And also he had a map on the wall, and he refers to the map on the wall so he can follow these different places he was, particularly during the 100 Days campaign, because they were constantly in the move. And so all of that, and so he got it published, and he sold it off, and then he was in a parish through the 20s, still having trouble, and then and the bishop gave him a year off. This is late 20s, and he wanted seclusion. So New Brunswick has a lot of trees, but there's some places more treed than others. So outside of Chatham, the railroad line runs up towards Bathurst. And partway up there, there's a community called Barty Bogue. And back from the rail track, 7 miles into the woods, was an old dilapidated log camp that had been used some years earlier. Murdoch went to it for a year. Now, the local population thought very highly of their Catholic priests, so they sent a young lad with them, late teenager, to look after him, and also to serve in this daily Mass, because he celebrated Mass daily. So he was there for a year, came out, bishop said, "How you doing?" And he said, so. So the bishop said, "Okay, I got a solution for him. I'll make him a chaplain." So he made him a chaplain to the local hospital. And he was chaplain for a year, and then he came back to his bishop. He says, no, this just isn't working. So in 1932, the bishop said, "Okay, then, you're off the hook. You no longer have to be a parish priest. Go do what you need to do to, keep on going." So he's back to Barty Bogue, 7 miles back in the woods in this log camp, all through the 1930s, all through that time. And the only way to be resupplied was for them to drop stuff off at the train station, which was just a stop, not a community really, and then it would go back into the woods following Murdoch. But he was very highly thought of because the local ladies in Chatham would make beans and cakes and pies, put them on the train, and the train would stop or slow down and drop them off at the railroad track, and the young lad would come out, pick them up, and take them back into the woods. Murdoch would come out to do retreats, often every year, and that's the way he lived all the way through the 1930s. I have found, due to the records here in Ottawa, that he came out for the Second World War and offered himself for the chaplaincy service. And he was actually down in Sussex for a year or so, because Sussex, New Brunswick had an enormous camp during the Second World War, training infantry primarily, and Murdoch was there. And there was quite a bit of contention as to what he'd be paid, etc., back and forth. And then once the war ended, he goes back to Barty Bogue. That's the way, and then through the 50s, he was getting older and not as well. He had to move out from the log camp to the railroad tracks. At the railroad tracks, there were a couple sheds. Murdoch moved into one of the sheds by the railroad line, and it was just a shed. One of the times in the 50s, when he was doing a retreat in Chatham and Newcastle, vandals struck and destroyed everything he had there, including taking his mass set from the First World War.
Oh, no.
Gone, disappeared.
That's
And any books or diaries or stuff like that also destroyed. The story I was told is he went back and he found this, and there was someone with him at the time, and Murdoch went in, he looked and saw just the devastation. Of course, his mass set was gone, and so if that's gone, there's nothing worth staying for. He just turned his back and walked away. And the person who related that story said that Murdoch had learned to be able to leave things behind. And these worldly things, even his very precious and valued mass set, was something that he could leave behind and go forward. Through the 1960s, his health continued to deteriorate. Physical health, he had to move out in the late 60s to Chatham. He was in a residence associated with the church and a nursing home. In the early 1970s, the Pope made him a Monsignor, and in 1973, January the 31st, I believe it was, he passed away in Chatham, New Brunswick, and he's buried in the local cemetery. There was a problem that Murdoch and many other soldiers had after the First World War, and it was with their exit medical. Of course, the Canadian government wanted to make sure that the soldiers who were being discharged were fit, and so there was this exit medical. And Murdoch had 2 exit medicals, one overseas and one in Canada. And one of the questions in the form was, basically, do you have any, they didn't use the word psychological, but, any emotional, etc., issues or things due to your war service? And he said no twice. Just like many of the soldiers, the infantry and the artillerymen, said when they were asked about their physical health, having their lungs, etc., burned out from gas, said, "No, I'm just fine." Yeah, but I'm just fine. And so later, when there was the attempt to get pensions by the men who'd been gassed and said no, or by Murdoch, who suffered from PTSD, the government could point, well, here's 2 exit medicals, and you answered no twice. Did you lie, Father? So, you know, he was between a rock and a hard place. So this is one of the reasons why people were very supportive of him going out and doing the Second World War thing in Sussex, so that might generate some pension for him. And so the local law in that part of the Miramichi is that the federal government denied Father Murdoch any pension. And it was a persistent injustice by the federal government against the local priest. So that's just part of the legacy. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
We get one last question.
Not a question as such. I'd like to thank you for doing this. I have a copy of the 3rd printing signed by you.
Wow.
I started collecting these 40 years ago when I got my commission. And I actually have several dozen books on chaplaincy, including some First War, some in French about Canadian chaplains. I thank you because I'm so relieved to hear that I wasn't a weirdo.
That's very important.
But I started collecting them to address the question the gentleman in the front row raised. Were these ever used to train future generations of chaplains? The answer was no. So when I got my commission as a chaplain in '78, there was no chaplain training. I was a reservist, there was no training for reservists, and even in the regular force, they might give you officer training, but there was no training to be a chaplain. In fact, when I started collecting these books and reading them, Ken and Scott and all the others, and their experiences, and that kind of, I guess, formed my understanding of the chaplaincy should be. When I became the area chaplain of LFCA in 1980, was it? I instituted chaplain training for chaplains because I had more reserve chaplains, Protestant, than the regular force did. I was responsible for recruiting and damn it, we've got to train them. So the area commander supported me and funded training courses for chaplains. I incurred the wrath of the regular force chaplain, who came and told me, "David, you have to stop this." And I said, no. And then a couple of years, the chaplain training center stood up in Marion and Borden. So that's why I started collecting these, because I wanted to know where do you learn what it means to be a chaplain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I have this whole collection, which I haven't read the French ones yet because they're really cramped.
Yes, certainly. Yes, part of the reason I really didn't think that they did serve any of that sort of purpose for training future chaplains is that New Brunswick has quite a unique distinction in that we have a second rather famous Roman Catholic chaplain, Miles Hickey of the Second World War and the North Shore Regiment, which was a D-Day regiment, infantry regiment, of which they've made a historical moment too. You can see it on television. Miles Hickey was a young priest in the Miramichi area who knew Father Benedict Murdoch, and he went to him in, I think it was 1940 it would have been, to ask him what Murdoch thought about the prospects of, well, should I become the Roman Catholic chaplain to this new North Shore regiment? And Murdoch, according to Hickey, said, yes, you should. It'd be a wonderful opportunity to your father. You might be killed. And but by Murdoch meant martyred in the service of his fellow man and in serving the Savior. So that was Murdoch's very blunt, frank, and not sugar-coated advice to Raymond Miles Hickey. And Miles Hickey went on to write, after return in 1949, rather quickly after, one of those few immediate World War II chaplain accounts, and called The Scarlet Dawn, referring to the D-Day beaches of June the 6th, 1944. And Hickey, spending a few hours actually on the beach doing last rites and such like. And so he was there as well. In his book, I've written an article which argues that his book is modeled consciously off of Murdoch's The Red Vineyard. And actually the title too is kind of juxtaposed. The Red Vineyard in one hand and The Scarlet Dawn on the other. So a very clear comparison even in the level of the title. So that's how things were passed on within that small circle of Roman Catholic priests on the Miramichi during the 20th century. Miles goes to Murdoch, and that's the advice he gets. Oh yeah, go. You might be killed. But that would be a good thing.
Okay.
Anything else?
Well, we'll do the thank you. I just want to say on behalf of all here, I'm sure they're going to pardon me, but I just want to say thank you very much for coming and doing this. I didn't mention at the beginning that he flew in from Halifax.
No, from Fredericton.
Oh, New Brunswick. Oh, I thought you'd gone. Okay, yeah.
That's
heaven
all right,
forbid-
too, that's all right.
Heaven forbid New Brunswick to come in.
I am a Nova Scotian, but I live
Well,
in
in
New Brunswick.
fact, I was just gonna, we might talk about Anglican padres in Nova Scotia. Anyway, having said that, on behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.